All right, we're going to continue with section 7.5, those simplifications, simplifying these different types of problems. So as I said before, you're going to have these in front of you, hopefully. Hopefully you know the pairs of reciprocals by now. That makes your life a lot easier. Hopefully you also know these ones too, and you can refer back to them. So we're going to see these a bunch. And so the strategy we talked about was, if I want to break things down, one of the big strategies is to break things down into both sines and cosines. We talked about how if you saw cosecant or secant, so if you saw either one of those, you would use the reciprocal identities. You'd say, okay, well, cosine's 1 over sine, secant's 1 over cosine. If you saw a tangent or cotangent, you'd use these quotient identities. And if you saw a sine or cosine, you would just rewrite them. That takes any 6 trig functions and breaks it down to simply be 2, which again, that's a definition of simplifying right there. So let's look at another one. Sine squared plus cosine squared over cosine squared. So first off, if we did that strategy, honestly, right now, that wouldn't help. Why not? Well, they're already in terms of sines and cosines. So that doesn't help me. Okay, well, so there's something there. I'm hoping you're looking at this and you see, hey, I've seen something like that, or I know for sure. Something up here you've seen on here. And if you look close enough, you can recognize this. That's the most famous one that people remember. It's right there. Sine squared plus cosine squared simply equals 1. So I know that the top right there is going to be 1, and I'm over cosine. Now, it's cosine squared. Now, I'm not done. I can simplify this further. We've seen this before, 1 over cosine. So we know right here, 1 over cosine is really secant. So normally, and again, there's a couple ways you could write it, but if I have 1 over cosine, we know that. We know this. 1 over cosine equals secant. What happens if I would square both sides? So if I take this side and square it and this side and square it, what I'd end up getting would be, I'd have 1 squared is 1, cosine squared is cosine squared, and then this would equal secant squared. So right there, I have 1 over cosine. Now, you don't have to show this work. I'm just showing you why it's okay. But if I take this, that's simply just secant squared. Now, that's as far as I can go. There's nothing else I can do. And I notice that some people might try to stop here, even though there are ways to finish up. But this is as far as we can go. And like I said in the last video, the problem is you don't always know, where do I stop, where do I not stop? So it definitely can be very difficult in those regards. So I think it's helpful to be able to see some examples, see some worked out. You can also look at the book examples too. They have a lot more there too. So log into the book to do that. Okay, let's look at one more. So cosecant times secant minus cotangent of A. So none of these are squared, which is okay. Notice I want to point out, going back to this last example, if that just said sine plus cosine, that's not equal to 1. So all of these, notice, these down here are all squared. You can't just square root both sides and think that that's going to work, because it won't. I said this in one of my videos, that if you square root something that's being added together, so you can't say this. The square root of A plus B is not equal to the square root of A plus the square root of B. So you can't tell me that if I square root this left side, that's sine plus cosine, because it's not. So I want to kind of point that out, because that's a very common misconception in math. So these have to be squared. These guys don't, but you can square them. And like I said before, when I squared this and this, I got secant squared equals 1 over cosine squared. So that's a little bit different. So these are not. So let's use the strategy we talked about. If you see a sine or a cosine, rewrite it. Okay, I don't have that. If I see a secant or a cosecant, which I do right there, I can simplify that and say, well, that's 1 over sine. So I use my reciprocal identities. So that's this one. And then secant, that's 1 over cosine. Minus, and then cotangent. So we said with cotangent, we're going to use our quotient identities. Well, cotangent is cosine over sine. Okay, now what can I do? Well, first off, these are both being multiplied, so I'm going to multiply across. I'm going to combine that to be one fraction. So like I said before, you're going to have to know your properties of adding, multiplying, subtracting, dividing fractions. So when I multiply across, so 1 times 1. On the bottom, I'm doing sine times cosine, which is just simply sine times cosine. And then over here, minus, and then that'll just be cosine over sine. Okay, so now I have a subtraction problem. So anytime we add or subtract, as we've been reviewing a bunch over this entire year with these, you have to have a common denominator. Now, this is almost common. Like they both contain a sign, but notice that this one has a cosine. Well, I want this one to have a cosine. So I can multiply of this one, I can multiply the top and also the bottom. I'm able to do that. Remember, that's the equivalent of 1. When you multiply something by 1, it doesn't change the value of it. But that's helping me get a common denominator. So I would have 1 over sine times cosine minus, up top, cosine times cosine, that's cosine squared. On the bottom, sine times cosine. So now you have a common denominator, which is exactly what I want. When you have a common denominator, we're able to write that one time. So I write that one time, and then I add or subtract the numerators depending on what it says. Well, my numerators say 1 minus cosine squared. So 1 minus cosine squared. So now I have to simplify this further because that doesn't seem very simplified. So I need to go here and look at something. And again, one of these things I'm hoping that you've seen before. So where do you see on here a 1 minus cosine squared? Well, I see it right here. I've got this right here. 1 minus cosine squared equals sine squared. And like I said before, just knowing these are going to make your lives a lot easier the next couple of weeks. And this is just studying these and reviewing these and just knowing it enough. I mean, every time you do these problems, you have these in front of you and you'll have them memorized. So 1 minus cosine squared, that equals sine squared. So then here, I'm left with sine squared. So I get sine squared over sine times cosine. Okay. Now at this point, I kind of have to see what I'm left with, but notice that both of these, you have a sine value. Now this doesn't cancel out completely because I have one sine here and I have 2 sines here. Because remember, sine squared is really sine times sine. So this is what I call like a partial cancellation. So I can take 1 away from here, that's gone. I can take 1 away from here and I'm left with 1. Because again, if this is sine times sine and I take one of those away, I'm just left with 1 of them. And so that would leave you, give yourself some more space over here. That would leave you with just a sine now. Over on the bottom, you're left with just a cosine. So again, you had a sine, but it canceled out, so you're left with a cosine. You had a sine squared, but you cancel one of them out, so you're just left with a sine to the first. So what's sine over cosine? Again, I can go one step further here. Where do you see a sine or a cosine? Sine divided by cosine. And what's that equal to? That's equal to tangent. Now, when we eventually, the next week, get to verifying identities, we'll know, hey, you're not done until you get to tangent. And we'll talk about that in the future.